before I start, let me ask, how many of you have intensely studied the New York State version of the Common Core English Language Arts Standards? Intensely studied. How many of you have watched any of the Engage New York videos?
No.
Cool. So I'm probably like going to say stuff you've been thinking for a while. How many of you have read Lucy Calkins et al.'s book on the Common Core State Standards and said, oh yeah, I thought of that, I thought of that, I thought of that, I thought of that. So that's how my talk will be for you today too. I'm going to predict that you will have thought of some of these things, but I did think of an angle. And I also want to say that our colleague, Virginia Goldley, who recently finished being Director of Research for the International Reading Association and is a professor at SUNY Albany, and I drafted an article somewhat related to this topic, so stuff that comes out of my mouth might inadvertently be genius. We just had a tentative accept for language and literacy spectrum for this year too, so I'm kind of talking about the politics of the research base. I should also say that one of my favorite resources about the Common Core Standards is a great chapter that P. David Pearson wrote about. If you saw him at the Literacy Research Association, he cited it. If you search on David's name and go to his website and say Common Core State Standards, the chapter will come up, but it's about the research base for the Common Core. It does an analysis and evaluation of the research base of the Common Core Standards, as well as kind of some of the instructional recommendations that are coming out along the way about how to address the Common Core State Standards. So those are some of my favorite sources, Judy Goatley and David Pearson. And then I've been reading and talking to colleagues and teachers about them for a bit of time. Oh, another really good source are my BOCES friends who are charged with turnkey training around New York State, who've had to do so much turnkey training related to Race to the Top in such a hurry that they found themselves kind of inventing answers to questions at some times or another, as you know, but we won't mention any names there. Okay, so another source. The title, Blind Spots in Our Shifts to the ELA Common Core and How to Address Them, some of you probably recognize as an allusion to the state-sponsored and actually national rhetoric around what are the Common Core ELA standards causing us to do that's different than what we did before. It's true that all of us, or many of us, practiced talking to each other about why the 6 shifts, say that 6 times really quickly, produces all kinds of interesting results, right? These days, some of the national rhetoric as well as the state rhetoric has reduced this 6 shifts. They've done a little bit of sentence combining, and we're down to talking about 3 shifts. So I'm going to use those as an organizational heuristic for part of this talk. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what changes are inherent in our new aspirational standards, blind spots, and then in answer to the question about what are the blind spots, 21st century literacies, talk a little bit about those, because of course we're not just about meeting standards and having kids pass tests, but we really actually want them to be literate for their lives, right? So there's that piece too. And then what does research say about addressing changes? And of course these are aspirational standards, so I use the phrase research in the sense of what does it give us ideas for doing more research on, not exactly what does the research say per se. And then what about the school context? And by then it'll be 2 o'clock and I'll be ready for lunch. Okay, so changes that are inherent. These days, the way people talk about the 3 shifts to these aspirational standards, and I'm going to keep using the words aspirational. And I use the word aspirational because, in fact, the standards are research-based in the sense that ACTE, Achieve, Inc., and the Governors Association, all the folks who work in the standards actually surveyed college and career locations to see what sorts of language arts skills they would expect people to have coming into those settings. And so the anchor standards, that is, which is it feels counterintuitive to me to call them anchor standards and then have them be the exit standards, right? But the anchor exit standards are based on the results of that survey, as well as, most of you know, a good bit of sort of tweaking to get it into parallel structure that most of us can recite off the top of our heads if we've been studying it for a while. I mean, a predictable text structure, pretty easy to talk about, and fairly easy to map onto what they're now calling the three shifts that the expectations are. Whether, and we can talk more about those shifts and whether they were really needed or not. Denise and I had a rousing discussion about it this morning. I like the fact that I heard Commissioner King use the word aspirational. We don't really know how to get there, or if these are the right standards, or what exactly it's going to take in terms of pedagogy. Despite the fact that some people are asserting they know what pedagogies we need to go to, or it seems like that, these are, as Commissioner King says, aspirational standards. It's much like what the Committee of 10 wrote at the turn of the, between the 1800s and the 1900s, and we were trying to figure out how to get immigrant students to be successful in public schools, right? I mean, it's like, what do we want people to do in order to get them ready for college? It's a little like what some of us really old folks remember about the Sputnik era, when we were like all going to, I don't know what it was, we were going to do new math and science and changes in literacy standards. I'm remembering this as the third grader, of course, right? So that we could all shoot men up into space. I'm not quite sure what and it was only men that we were shooting up into space back then. So it's hard to know why we were all working on new math and all that kind of stuff. But aspirational standards as in, it's what we're shooting for, but we're not exactly sure how it breaks out. We also, people who are critiquing the ELA standards generally don't go after the anchor standards per se, because it's the results of a survey, and you can talk about their strengths and limitations in terms of literacies they address, but rather they'll go after the grade level breakdown, because that part, especially as it gets down into the primary grades, or up into the primary grades, depending on your preference, is really where we're talking aspirational, but we really don't know if we can get first graders to discern the ideas and things that they do and read, right? I mean, it's not something that we've talked about a lot in the past. I mentioned some of my favorite sources. The Engage New York website continues to be a perpetual favorite, and it changes by the second. So if you're interested in how the Common Core standards are getting interpreted in our state and across the United States, it's a place to check regularly for updates, for sample lessons, for sample assessment questions, for curriculum maps, for all kinds of stuff is posted on there, some of which we'll all love and some of which some of us don't like very much at all. Achieve the Core is another source. The What Works Clearinghouse at the federal level has been changed to look a lot at commercial programs ranging from the simplistic workbooky stuff to professional staff development kinds of things. The New York City Board of Education website actually has interesting reading writing workshop, the ELA lesson plans on it. The International Reading Association has tons of stuff. NCTE has tons of stuff. And Hinchman and Stenhouse have been really quick to publish authors who have been addressing Common Core standards. So those are all good kind of practical places to go to figure out what's going on in the Common Core standards. The shifts are tied to, first, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. That move to nonfiction is huge, and most of us know as a response to a claim that, and there's actually some research support for this, that a lot of instruction in the English language arts over the last bit of time has focused mostly on narrative text. So the idea of building kids' knowledge, but also having them read nonfiction. Reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. And there's a shift as you look at the 4th to 6th grade standards, where suddenly the expectations become very literary and very much about nonfiction text, which parenthetically I think probably could be critiqued in terms of college and career readiness, how much are the expectations really for your ability to read literary nonfiction text compared to other kinds of nonfiction, like just plain old information text or whatever, but we could debate that at a different time too. And then regular practice with complex text and its academic language. If you've looked at all at the math Common Core standards, there's an intersection there with number 3 too. The math standards really emphasize discursive practices as being part and parcel of understanding math as a discipline, and engaging in those processes means you have a language to also talk about the processes along the way, so there's an overlap there. Just like response to intervention has disappeared, well, it's appeared, it's morphed anyway, as school districts realized the No Child Left Behind, adequate yearly progress requirements, and all of a sudden, I mean, some of us were going, good, we have to look at data for disaggregated subgroups, and this will get at the issues of like achievement gap, and it will get at what we're doing for special ed kids. And then you find out over here that the way the rules get interpreted is you get bonus points if you're in a district that gets 100% attendance on their ELA tests. And so you might not have to tell anybody that your special ed kids are using that progress or the progress numbers that it gets along that, which is sort of interesting. So as all the pieces of No Child Left Behind came together, stuff started to like morph into forms people didn't recognize. The quick implementation of Common Core learning standards in New York State or Common Core state standards, if you operate at a national level, is, at least in my experience with our local school systems and regional school systems at the Syracuse part of the state, are disappearing under the larger aegis of what's going on with Race to the Top more broadly. And so in Race to the Top, especially the Common Core assessments, I know that they've released sample items for the Common Core based ELA test that will be used this spring. It's not the exact items, but they're sample items of what's going to be used. That has a lot of folks who wrote curriculum to the new standards last summer going, this isn't what we thought it meant at all, and sort of scrambling around to figure out how to get at the kinds of stuff that's asked by those sample items along the way. So the assessment is putting a wrinkle in things. And then the new teacher evaluation systems, and parenthetically coming for us, the campus is near us soon, is the EdTPA, the teacher education assessments. So all of us are addressing a lot of new stuff all at the same time, right? And two, if you happen to work in an urban district, like say a Buffalo or Syracuse or New York City, where everybody at the state level and the federal level is always watching you all the time anyway, and you were already in trouble according to the No Child Left Behind rules for either subpopulations or overall for test scores, a lot of those urban districts are doing things like writing curriculum really quickly or using the state curriculum but adopting pacing guides that'll move people more quickly. So there's a lot of change in the air all at the same time that caused one of our local teachers to look at one of our students, undergrad student, she came into my office and she said, Dr. Hinchman, is it true? Is it true that you have us studying the Common Core ELA standards in a way that's going to make us better teachers than the teachers who are so busy looking at their pacing guides that they don't have time to like look at the standards and figure out what they're really teaching, and so they're going to get fired and we're going to get their jobs? Is that true? And so I looked at the child and said, I don't know, maybe. But that's what it feels like for all of us right now, right? In that kind of a context, though, we've got, just to describe the assessment system right now, we've got ELA tests every April. We have kids' performance being compared to their performance from the year before. We have teachers being evaluated on how their kids overall compare to overall the kids' performance from the year before. We've got especially, well, I think all the school systems with their teacher evaluation systems now combined with response to intervention assessments, there's 3 and 4 times a year of some sort of reliable, state-approved assessments through the year that frankly we don't know how those may apply to those Common Core assessments that are coming down the way. I mean, all these things are aspirational, right? There's so much of that stuff going on that people keep looking at the forest, right? Without thinking about any individual tree or any individual leaf in one tree. It's like the student forest, and ask, does the teacher make the forest a better place? Is she value added for that place? Is the language that we hear right now, which flies in the face of what we know, well, maybe it doesn't necessarily, but it feels at first glance like it flies in the face of what we know about individual kids figure out literacy for themselves. To teach literacy, we have to figure out ways to foster their thinking so that they keep making that progress. It's not a thing that happens because we spray the whole forest, right? It's every child for herself. We don't yet ask the question of what is this teacher doing for this one tree, though teachers I know who've gotten back pilot growth scores that the state's been producing and passing out to some of the districts around us at least, suggest that the move from using cut score instruction to having teachers look at their whole class roster and think about growth that a student's made from last year is pushing teachers, at least good teachers, into realizing they need to pay attention to the progress every single individual in the classroom is making. That's a pretty cool thing, but in the light of right now this whole miasm of thing, most people I know are still looking at the forest level instead of at the individual student level. This one teacher I'm thinking of who sort of gone to that other place was a reading recovery teacher. She's got a master's in literacy that's 30 years old. She's taught in urban, rural, and suburban school districts, so she's an experienced person who's used to worrying over individual kid progress, and so she's got it pretty quickly, I think, but that's not what I see most people going through. It's not what pedagogies are needed to meet the needs of each of these quite different trees, and how do we do this all at the same time, right? There's language about, in fact, the secondary teachers I know describe it as people yelling at them and saying, differentiate, but not telling them what that means or what it looks like or how they're supposed to get people to this other place and differentiate at the same time, and there's that whole sort of thing. So in an age of aspirational standards, I mean, there's quite different trees out there, and it's going to be a challenge for us to work together to figure out how to meet all their needs at the same time. Thanks for hanging in there with me for this extended metaphor. It's still going. Not why have some of the leaves changed on this tree while others haven't, right? How do kids' performances change by text type, or text complexity, or topic, or what we're focusing on with this set of comprehension questions, or the way we're deciding to focus or look for author's purpose. Or how does writing change by task and genre, and how do we build from there? Instead, in New York State, some of our outside consultants, without mentioning any names, beautiful. Wait, did they come up please, sir? No. I'm looking through my fingers. We're told to stop babying kids, to have rigor for kids, so that everybody can soar, expect them to read and write hard stuff, and they will somehow. I mean, the pedagogy sounds like magical thinking in some respects, doesn't it? Indeed. Indeed. Well, we could talk about that.
We won't go there, okay.
Well, there's like, I think there's a pretty reasonable argument. I heard Dave Pearson say this. It's like, how many picture walks does one child need? From preschool through high school, before we say, when you look at a book yourself, you could do, with gradual release of responsibility, so the kid assumes the ability to do that for himself. It's like it's just like teaching methods classes in a pre-service teacher rep program. We all have to like cover the same terrain till we can get to the new stuff, and then we're surprised when we can't get to the new stuff. It's pretty amazing that we have so little kind of gradual release built in within it across grades when it comes to that stuff. So there's a reasonable critique about that purpose setting thing, but does it mean you have to take a kid who's like older and doesn't read very well and put a text in front of them that's going to make them cry and quit school? Probably that's not a good plan either. I mean, for some of those kids. There's the text complexity question where, you know, we're not sure if we're going to be able to get kids at X grade level to read texts at X level. And I don't know if you've seen the Lexile.com website, but they show complexity bands, and if you dig around the website, you can see how those have increased with what they're saying is expected by the Common Core state standards. It's sort of an interesting dilemma. Moving kids from the story and poetry writing that they might be more comfortable with to argumentative and explanatory writing that, of course, is evidence-based and text-based along the way. I see the reason. I mean, I've been doing content literacy stuff since I was a middle school teacher. I see the argument there, and I see sort of the tension in our profession between people who get kids to do the stuff they like to do, me included, and this academic stuff over here. And with aspirational standards, we don't have ways to go to that next place all that easily. But I don't think it's just a matter of babying the kids. And that might be part of it. And there might be a critique in there somewhere along the line. But to look at every leave and say, why does some change and others not, we're not quite there yet with the research. All right, sorry for the deficit orientation of this metaphor, but I found this picture of this leaf, one last extension of the metaphor, right? But just as the study of the decay, if you look, you can see the little holes here where some little bugs got into the whole thing. I apologize for the deficit. I don't mean that about kids. Different kids figure out literacy in different ways, right? And so what's going on with this leaf could affect the whole tree or the whole forest or the whole globe, right? Or at least the deciduous part. And yet, each leaf has to survive on its own, right? It has to be able to be successful on its own. Just as we don't know, though there are models of how to protect the forest in the face of climate change, and we can't even agree about that, right? We're not clear about what youth are going to need in order to meet those aspirational standards by any stretch. And so for people to go out there and just do like quick aphorisms and act like it's going to be simple and straightforward, I don't think you're doing the kids much service. At the same time, it's probably not doing all of us who are interested in combining traditions of literacy, usage, and pedagogy to address the aspirational standard. It's probably not going to do us a lot of good to do a lot of whining about those folks, because all we're doing is countering instead of sort of coming to the next place. One of the other blind spots, besides our penchant for looking only at gross whole class pencil and paper assessments instead of what individual kids' understandings are, I think is that the Common Core standards don't easily take us to a place of imagining generative 21st century literacy. The folks who developed the Common Core standards talk quite a bit about, well, technology's in there. It says multimodal text, and there's rumors that the park assessments at least are going to have some film as part of the park assessments, right? But that doesn't get us to the generative. It doesn't get kids to the generative place where they can keep building new literacies as the contexts change, which they change pretty quickly these days for all of us who are engaged in the digital world, right? Their world is going to change even more quickly. After we're gone, things change. Things change fast in the world of technology, and so what does it take to be proficient at 21st century literacies? It's multiple text forms. It's knowing their out-of-school literacies. It's knowing how they're shaped by those things, but it's also giving confidence in yourself to go to the next new place and having a willingness to get there. That's a thing that we know from studying those out-of-school literacies. Kids often get there before we do. In fact, a lot of young people, depending on resources, of course, are native, native millennial speakers, like digital natives, I think they talk about in that literature. They're way more likely to get new and changing literacies than anyone who's any older than they are, right? We had a discussion today about what platform we all use for instructional tools and distance education, because teachers in schools are using a different language that I don't speak anymore, and certainly the kids are doing things with Moodle and other forms that I don't know very much about at all, so it's sort of interesting. They're quicker at all those things than we are, and we have to figure out a way to design pedagogies that allow that to come to the table so we can all keep being effective in the changing context, but that leave them feeling generative about it. The other thing that's really important is to think about who all youth are and how they bring different kinds of knowledge, different social, cultural, and political constructions. Today's communication is multimodal. You want to give yourself pause as a literacy expert. Sit and think to yourself. I'll look at folks who work here in this center. If you had parents come to you and say, is it time for me to get him an iPad that will translate text for him into spoken word? Because I run our clinic, and that's the question I get from parents these days. I mean, I can take almost any block of text that I have to read and put it into one of those little apps on my phone and then listen to it read to me on a treadmill so that I don't have to look at the text. Now, granted, it gets pretty funny when it's academic text and the citations are in the text and the text reader just kind of reads along past the parentheses, puts the names in there. But I have enough familiarity with those texts to be able to work my way through it. Same thing's happening with kids, or kids who use dictation programs to dictate their writing along the way. That's the world that we're headed toward, right? At some point, I've spent a lot of time in my life figuring out how to teach older kids how to read multisyllabic words when they don't learn it when they're little kids in our clinic space. At some point, they're not going to have to do that. Or will it be the privileged kids who know how to do that, and the not so privileged kids who end up using the technology to do it? And you get access to some things by having one set of skills or another set of skills. Those are all really important questions for us to keep weighing all the time. I mean, what's our profession about that's different from your literacy if you don't need print anymore? Really need print. Or do we really need print? Like what does all of that mean? And so when kids are not verbal, or they bring different sets of verbal skills, or they don't speak English as the first language, or wherever the language happens to be that you're doing. And technology can take care of some of those issues for us. That's all part and parcel of the world that we're preparing kids for that isn't mentioned in the Common Core state standards and isn't going to be tested. And that has to be the spirit of what we prepare kids for, right? My dean, Doug Bicklin, talks a lot, too, about kids who have communication difficulties, like kids with autism, right? Nonverbal kids with autism, who used to get all lumped together with other kids with all kinds of special needs. One of my doc students is doing a dissertation on parents' perspectives toward the literacy instruction offered to their kids with intellectual disabilities, which is today's code for kids with Down syndrome, kids who typically would get tested as having lower IQs or whatever. And we all know, sitting in this room, that a lot of those kids over the last 50 years have gotten no literacy instruction whatsoever, because people didn't think they could learn anything other than sight words that would help them do their grocery shopping. and yet we haven't really tried. We haven't looked to see how to respond to their literacy initiations, because that's a 1 week at a time kind of enterprise, right? It's not easily, it's really hard to get a group that's big enough to do something that's going to generate gold standard research results that are going to move us to that other place along the way. So all youth really means all youth. A kind of cool thing about the new teacher assessments is that comparison of each kid to himself the year before, so that we're looking for something that's adequate yearly progress. The limitation in the modeling, of course, is how they're deciding who's like which kids, like what data points they have to work with and all of that. But that's a problem for another day. Okay, so all that, it's all youth, not just kids who need to go on one side or another of a cut score that we're concerned about, but it's also 21st century literacy that we're worried about. And then there's the Common Core aspirational standards. In that kind of a setting, how are we going to help youth build their knowledge with content-rich nonfiction? Things that people have talked about in the research, and there's actually research going on right now on one of the Reading for Understanding grants at University of Michigan, University of Illinois, Chicago, and folks at West Ed are working on one of the Reading for Understanding grants, where they're looking at, Cindy Shanigan and others have written about multimodal text sets, right? Using those as data sources to help kids build meta-narratives of perspectives toward answers to essential questions in their content-rich studies. I mean, what does that mean in science? What does it mean in study of history? What does it mean in study of English language arts? And having those texts be multimodal along the way. What does it mean to teach that kind of stuff? Certainly it isn't teaching the facts for the text. It's teaching a more perspective, nuanced understanding along the way. I say that at the same time that some folks will talk about the reading of the close reading of literary nonfiction. That's one of the terms that's getting tossed around a lot these days, right? Mm-hmm. As the text and only the text devoid of context, which competes with postmodern feminist, post-structural versions of what close reading meant as a contextualized look at the stance and figure out who's represented and who's not represented in the texts as it's presented here. So I'm going to guess that the jury is going to come down on the side of the contextualized notion of close reading and not the text and only the text. But clearly, you need to be able to figure out something about what text means before you ask the question of what context was this text produced in and who were the writers and what was their agenda along the way. Or maybe not before, but in addition to, because we don't always have all the information that comes along with the text we need to understand, especially in digital literacy environments where people play with text all the time and don't let you know who the authors are and all that kind of good stuff. But the idea of perspective understandings, I think, through lots of reading and writing, lots of viewing of lots of different kinds of texts is the way that we're going to get there. And there is some research that talks about doing that. We're just not quite sure how to get the levels of complexity that they're talking about yet with the Common Core standards. And then how do we help all youth use text as evidence for narrative, for arguments, and for their explanations? We know things about explaining and modeling comprehension. A kind of bad thing that's happened over the last few years is people who teach comprehension strategies for strategy's sake without helping kids to understand that the objective is to comprehend the text, to figure out what perspective it's representing. Maybe those of us who are engaged in inquiry can sort of back up and start doing inquiry on some of the constructs that are represented in those Common Core standards, like author's purpose and how's the author using the genre in order to get at this purpose. What are the elements of text in there? And then if you look at the test questions people are developing around author's purpose, it's more like, in paragraph 3, line 2, the author says this. How does that fit her overall purpose? Those are Now that's a test-driven permutation of author's purpose, I understand, but at the same time, that's a kind of question that can cause all of us to ponder text in a new and different way that is part and parcel of recognizing how authors are using genre at the sentence level and at the grand text level, I think. The thing that we've known and talked about for decades, linguists, sociolinguists, language developers, Brian Camborne, all the way back through the whole language time and earlier, talked about the balance of situated practice and explicit teaching. But that balance is different for different people, depending on what funds of knowledge they bring about process and content to the table, right? All of, like, designing pedagogy that's sensitive to those differences and helps us move forward is a place where we need to go if we really are going to help kids to do the narrative, argumentative, explanatory writing and composition, if not always writing, that they need to do. I continue to be a fan of using mentor text and study of mentor text, but please tell me where we can find lots of good examples of argumentative published texts. Not kids' essays, but argumentative, real-life, authentic text that you could read with 5th, 6th, and 7th graders. There's not tons of it easily accessible without like rereading all the editorial pages of every, which is the thing we're all doing now, right? Is like looking around for those kinds of examples, but really gathering together examples of things that kids can read and use as mentor text so they can do analysis collaboratively about what authors are meaning to do with the way they structure their texts and what kinds of perspectives are getting represented in those things. And I've long been a fan of gradual release of responsibility, that the Godspeed notion that Pearson and Gallagher came up with, to the point where I'll even use that language with kids along the way. It's like, here's the thing we're trying to help you be able to do, help us figure out how to release control so that you can take charge of it. Of course, it's way easier to do in this kind of a setting than it is in a classroom with 27 children. One of the things that occurs to me is, especially in the urban schools near us, where they're using pacing guides and like sort of trying to address Common Core standards as best they can, seeing the test examples and going, oh, this is what they meant by this, and like doing some quick adjustments along the way. I am thinking that there's going to be some pretty darn awesome perspective reading and writing going on in May and June in New York State. I'm very pleased to write because the tests are given in April. Yay! You think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding. They're not, because they won't have test results back so that they can start working on the next year's test results, right? It's going to be the old. I know when I first went from graduate school to higher ed, I actually had occasion to work for BOCES, which interrupted my academic trajectory for a bit of time. But I was horrified to find out that after the old norm reference tests that were given at the end of April were administered, I'd say to teachers, so how about having an early morning breakfast meeting and I'll come and do some stuff in classrooms and whatever, and like May 15th, they'd be like, oh, we're done then. You'd be like, I'm a taxpayer in New York State. I don't think you're done on May 15th. This is me, the academic voice is sort of coming out along the way. Well, now the tests are like in the beginning of April. This is great. This is a great thing for those of us who favor like inquiry and lots of like hands-on text, hands-on integration type things that can go on. We're going to have a ball in May and June. I think it'll be great. Sorry. How do we help? The third shift. How do we help all youth engage with complex text and its academic language? Michael Graves talked about helping kids create self-extending vocabulary systems, getting them to notice words. Those of us who are old folks remember when that used to happen in school. Who knows what happened to it? This is not just word walls. This is excitement and enchantment about how you say words, how the words work. You know, the upper level word study and words their way, that kind of, the cool stuff about words work and how words work and where they come from and what's generative about them is part of those self-extending vocabulary systems. Some of the kids that we see in our literacy practicum, the older kids, I've noticed, it's like that heart and literacy study becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you look at a kid who's like from an urban school or mothers only 15 years older than he is. You go through this whole thing, and so teachers come to the kid by saying, well, you come to us with nothing. I'm exaggerating, right? And then you watch the kid reading a passage, and he comes to a word he doesn't know, and he gives up. And you get him to talk about the word a little bit. Sometimes you can even pin it down to one single word. You talk about it, and as the kid talks, you realize he knows as much about the meaning of that word as some of his suburban colleagues would know about the meaning of the word, but all the messages of what he's gone through in school give him no confidence to keep going with his best guess. Compared to, so some of the self-extending vocabulary systems are being willing to have a go at a text when you don't know exactly what all the words mean, but you have an idea, right? It's that what do you do when you come to a word you don't know? It's a harken back to the questions that people asked in the 1920s, but it's that same set of questions, right? The folks at Wested and others talk about having metacognitive conversations with difficult texts. Part of the academic language issue is discourse in context. Jay Lemke wrote about learning to talk science and learning to read, write, speak, and listen mathematics discourse. We talk about, the math folks have done amazing research on math communication and integration between discursive acquisition and problem solving. We need to look at how kids do in the global history regions in New York State, with some of our regions saying, no, we make them learn too much content in 2 years, the test has too much stuff on it. Meanwhile, the president of the Social Studies Council is saying, no, it's because we do all text-based teaching and the kids don't do enough reading. Perspectived reading. She said this, by the way, before the standards were released. Perspectived reading about the constructs involved in that exam. Good readers do well on those tests because they know how to read the information that's contained and asked for in those questions. They get the qualification that's needed to understand, the social sciences, after all, right? It's very interesting. So metacognitive conversations with text, and then differentiated teaching methods that foster kids' stamina for varying texts, getting them to be willing to take chances along the way. So those are shifts, but the things that I'm saying, we have research support for the ideas that I talked about with each of those shifts, the text sets, the building academic self-extending vocabulary systems, the having of metacognitive conversations. All those things we've got good research support for, but not as they work for these aspirational standards or these more complex texts. These are all like areas ripe for inquiry. And it's also ripe for us to start thinking about how do kids bring different funds of, how do all kids bring different funds of knowledge to the table that we can help them to build on so that they can develop relative independence with each level of complexity that they encounter along the way. The stuff that usually gets talked about, and we can talk more about this, in terms of literacy programs and programs that will let people do this, is you have building and district literacy leaders, representative teams, you have ongoing long-term planning revision cycles for your program development. A lot of the school reform people are talking about data-driven collaboration, but they don't talk about how different data gives you different information. And usually they talk only about the 10,000-foot level data, the annual tests, or the 5,000-foot level, or the beginning, middle, and end of year group-administered tests. Well, I'd argue, this is my favorite one, sorry, this is worse than the tree metaphor, the data at sea level. See, where you actually like look at what kids are doing and talk to each other about it. Sorry, I apologize. Sea level. So, well, you can cite me with it. There's this crazy woman going through it. Resource collection within and across grade levels, so teachers can have access to those multi-level texts that where they're thinking about challenging kids with more complex text over time, instead of being like one of the children in my house read Matilda 4 years in a row because she picked it. Well, she picked it because she was reading other stuff and didn't want to spend any energy on whatever. I mean, you know, there's got to be a little more challenge in the curriculum. I like Roald Dahl as much as the next person, but whatever. Curriculum mapping that looks at those standards and does some backward mapping and then starts looking at what the assessment results say. And I mean, that is a day-to-day inquiry project in anybody's classroom, right? Is to think about how does this map translate with kids? What do I have to cut and add in order to be here by a certain time, or in order to make sure I get to this? Those are bad questions to ask if we really want to make sure we have kids who are ready for college and career, I think. With some sense that it's not just the test that we're preparing kids for, and it is all kids that we're talking about to influence with. One of my annual projects is to have, because we're an NCATE accredited institution, which means our literacy master's program is like a special program area that's approved by the International Reading Association, and that means we have to address both classroom pedagogy and coaching, right, in expertise along the way. So I have a friend who's a middle school principal in the community who likes to come in and lay out the test scores for everybody, and then ask the students for advice in the literacy master's program. Well, she's a middle school principal, so a lot of what she hears are, you should do content-area literacy, like they've never heard this before. New literacy slash. You should do content literacy, and you should have everybody using the same language to talk about reading and writing strategies. I mean, which are good recommendations for beginning reading specialists to be making along the way, right? This one guy raises his hand and says, Dr. Hinchman, you know how you make us look at the Common Core standards, and then we have to show how a lesson might contribute to, like, how does that all tie into report cards in school? The principal and I looked at each other and went, bingo, out of the mouths of babes, right? It's like, it doesn't really tie into, I mean, it can in one sense, but really, if we let if we figure out a way to let kids and their parents in on what the standards are asking for and what we'd expect beyond the standards, then there could be a lot more collaboration and communication community-wide about that. I'm not sure what that beast looks like, but there could be some, he really did strike a chord with both of us, and we said, we spent all this time doing report cards, and you know, it's like numbers on worksheets. It's not, it's like a little crazy. Missing on this list that I've been reading in the math standards literature this week, missing from this list that is really important too, I think, is teachers' ongoing study of disciplines that they teach. I don't know about the rest of you, but I learned how to be an English teacher of adolescence when I was still an adolescent. Let's ponder that thought for a minute. Freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year of college. I took my 36 or 40 or 45 hours of English literature, writing, speaking courses, right? And then I became a reading specialist, and I never studied any of that stuff again. It's not an area of expertise I have, though it could be if I did more literary reading along the way. I know near us, some teachers of science get those little NSF study grants and they go off and study things, but I know a lot of teachers are so immersed in curriculum mapping and writing. What do they call them? SLOs? If you know what Isn't that an unfortunate acronym if you've ever heard one?
I like to read. Actually, my house has been reversed that way.
Which
It said S-O-L instead of S-O-L.
what's good one, I like it.
My husband called it.
I know that. I hear ya. I hear you. So they're spending all their time writing this stuff and following pacing guides, right? But there's not a ton of study to learn more about your discipline. And if you think about our urban schools, how many of the teachers in urban schools annually, in high need schools annually, like really rural ones too, are brand new teachers, or are within their first 5 years of teaching? I mean, you make it to 10 years in a high need school district, and you get hired in the suburbs with some alacrity, right? And so in that kind of a context, how much do we reinforce ongoing study within the disciplines? I mean, the teachers union used to give grants, or they probably still do, to to travel to the places in the world that you cover in global studies or history class, right? So you can gather artifacts and be enthusiastic in sharing ideas with kids and information and text. That's got to be also part of what the plan is if we're really talking about academic literacy and discipline-specific literacies. And you were going to say something.
I was just thinking, you're talking from an English perspective, but so many elementary teachers don't have a background in writing or even a lot of background in genre. And so now all of the stuff that you're talking about, you know, with the reading and the writing obviously being more connected and writing these different genres, I think there's a gap in understanding. And you teach a language arts class, right? And we find out there's a gap in there even understanding the genre. Because you're talking about, well, taking it from a story to a poem to an argumentative, right? I think that's going to be very hard for people, not for lack of ability, effort, etc., but it has not been the focus for many. Especially if you've been teaching a long time and been certified for a while, that may not have been the focus of your program when you went through it. But I don't know that that's really being the focus of the professional development for teachers to move through this either. I mean, it's been a lot of curriculum mapping and what methodological thinking or change. People who work in schools can speak to that better than I can. But I think that's going to be a hard thing.
That's going to be a hard thing, and so is the TPA assessments at the secondary level that ask teachers to identify such aspects of genre as how syntax influences genre. Or seriously, I had a colleague who went to the Alliance for Excellent Education website and did their TPA webinar, participated in that before the New York State Founding Footy show that happened last week, or the week before, whenever it came through town, right? She was running around the office between December 15th and January 15th. She orchestrates a lot of the literacy across the curriculum stuff at our place, and she's like, where can I find an easy thing to share with like phys ed teachers, new phys ed teachers, about identifying syntax in the text they read with their students? Like, I don't know where you're going. We finally I ended up focusing on some of the newer academic language for those who teach new speakers of English. Some of those practitioner texts, like methods texts, have more in it about the study of discourse than what the literacy pool has of this tradition.
G, discourse analysis, but it's a lovely job of that.
Which text is it?
G and really rich examples and different explications. Nice job.
One of my doc students has my copy of that book, and right now has like 737 postal notes in it.
But then just did a new, I think there's even there's a 2010, and I think we copied it in 2005 as well. So really rich examples.
That second chapter, it's good. The whole covered that. So with all of that, what thoughts do you have along the way, besides the fact that we're all going to have to study up?
I think the argumentative text too, and I think instead of thinking of text in print, that some argumentative text we might be able to start to use with